The words hit the air like a thunderclap. Silence fell across the grand chamber of the Galactic Council. 1,000 murmurs died mid-sentence, tentacles froze in motion, mandibles paused mid-click, and countless alien eyes turned in unison toward the source of the question. There, standing alone beneath the council's vaulted skylight, was a human, David Harris, representative of Earth, dressed in a simple navy suit, hands at his sides, expression calm, curious, and unmistakably smiling. He had spoken those words with no hint of sarcasm or fear, just curiosity, and maybe a little charm. At the far end of the chamber, towering behind a curved desk of obsidian and crystal, sat Counselor Zaru of the Varelians, one of the most respected and feared members of the council. 7 feet tall, with glistening color-shifting scales and eyes like molten mercury, Zaru was known for his sharp judgment and zero tolerance for nonsense. Beside him sat his companion Zephyr, a Cathar. Even among the council, few had ever seen one in person. White as snow, serpentine, and lethal, the Cathar were apex predators from the outer rim, not pets, not allies, forces of nature, really, born of storm and fury. The legends said they could tear through armored convoys and vanish into shadow-like whispers. No creature had ever tamed one. Most wouldn't dare get within 10 feet. Even fewer survived the attempt. And yet, David was casually asking if he could give one a pat on the head. Zaru's eyes narrowed into reptilian slits. His scales shimmered with hints of green and indigo colors the council's diplomats had learned meant agitation. His voice came out low, slithering like stones scraping metal. "Human, you just." "What?" David tilted his head slightly, that same casual smile still on his face. "I asked if I could pet your dragon." The murmurs returned. Some were sharp hisses, others sounded like clicking bones or water boiling. Council members whispered translations to their aides, confirming they had indeed heard the human correctly. Zaru hissed, his voice amplifying through the chamber. "The Cathar are not pets. They are the pinnacle of evolutionary precision hunters without equal. Your request is not only foolish, it is insulting." David shrugged, unfazed. "No insult intended, Counselor. I've just always had a way with animals, and I figure, if we're going to understand each other, we should probably try connecting. You know, like beings, not just political roles." The counselors stared. It wasn't just that he'd made the request, it was how he made it. As if the idea of stroking the scales of a killing machine was normal. Zephyr, the Cathar, had been lying still until now, coiled beside Zaru like a living statue. But now its massive head shifted slightly. Pale blue eyes opened. They were piercing like looking into a glacier, and they were focused entirely on the human. The tension in the room thickened. Zaru's eyes darted to Zephyr. The creature's muscles tensed. A low rumble began to build from its throat, a sound that, on more than one battlefield, had been the last thing heard by entire platoons. Still, David didn't move. He didn't flinch. He simply stepped forward. "Permission to approach?" he asked softly. For a long moment, Zaru didn't answer. He studied the human, this fragile, warm-blooded biped from an insignificant blue planet on the edge of the galactic map. Was this bravery? Ignorance? Arrogance? Perhaps all three. Finally, Zaru gave a slight nod, though his voice remained cold. "You may approach, at your own peril." David smiled again, genuinely this time, and took another step, then another. The distance between him and Zephyr closed slowly, methodically. Every movement in the chamber stopped. Even the airflow seemed to still. Zephyr growled louder, the kind of sound that hits the chest before the ears. Its wings twitched slightly. Muscles rippled beneath smooth, ivory scales. And then David stopped, standing just a few feet away, raised his hand not quickly, not slowly, just naturally, As if greeting a skittish horse or a neighbor's golden retriever, he whispered something no one else could hear. Just a few words, soft and careful. The growling stopped. Zephyr's head tilted. The blue eyes narrowed, unblinking. Then, in a motion that sent ripples of disbelief through the watching audience, Zephyr lowered its head just slightly. David reached forward and placed his hand on the top of the Cathar's snout. Gasps echoed across the chamber like ricocheting bullets. One alien diplomat actually fell out of its levitating chair. Another covered 3 of its mouths in shock. David began gently stroking Zephyr's head. The creature didn't resist, didn't even growl. Instead, it let out a low, almost imperceptible rumble, not of threat, but of contentment. Zaru's scales shifted once more, this time to a stunned silvery hue. "Remarkable," he whispered. David looked up, still gently scratching behind one of Zephyr's horns. "I think it's about trust," he said, loud enough now for everyone to hear. "Maybe some empathy, too. We humans were new to all of this. But that doesn't mean we have nothing to offer." No one said anything for several seconds. The chamber had seen wars declared, peace forged, even worlds sentenced to death, but nothing like this. Zaru stood slowly, stepping toward the scene. "You have done what no one has even dared, human," he said. "You have earned the respect of a Cathar." "This is unprecedented," David chuckled. "Well, I guess Zephyr likes me." As if to confirm it, Zephyr gave a low huff and pressed its head gently into David's hand. The sound that followed could only be described as a purr, a soft, deep, vibrating hum that settled through the air like warm thunder. For the first time in Galactic Council history, there was not a single voice raised in argument or protest. Just silence, awe, and the feeling that something important, something big had just happened. Zaru raised a hand, ignaling the chamber to quiet as he addressed the assembly. "This day marks a new chapter in our understanding of humanity," he declared, his voice resonant. "Let it be known that Earth is home to beings of rare courage and rarer compassion. We have much to learn from them." David gave a small nod of appreciation, but he didn't respond right away. His focus remained on Zephyr, because in that moment, everything he had hoped for, everything he had dreamed about when Earth first joined the galactic community was right in front of him. He hadn't just formed an alliance, he had built a bridge made not of treaties or weapons, but of kindness, of simple, honest trust. And as Zephyr let out another low, satisfied purr and settled comfortably beside him, David realized this wasn't just a diplomatic success. It was the beginning of something far greater than anyone in that chamber could yet understand. Zephyr's head rested comfortably against David's palm. His icy blue eyes half-lidded in what could only be described as cautious relaxation. The Cathar's breathing had slowed, rhythmic and calm. The massive dragon-like creature had gone from ready-to-strike predator to something else entirely. Not submissive, not tamed, but connected. No one in the council chamber moved. A moment ago, they had expected blood, shouts, chaos, a security breach, maybe even a tragedy. But instead, they were witnessing history unfolding quietly, almost gently. Zaru, for once, didn't speak. His gaze, intense and flickering with shifting shades of violet and silver, remained locked on Zephyr's body language. It was clear even to him something profound had happened between the human and the Cathar. But how? Counselor Zaru, a thin voice, finally spoke. Counselor Threx of the Ellerin, a crystalline species that communicated through harmonics. How is the Cathar not attacking? This goes against every behavioral study, every evolutionary instinct. Zaru's eyes narrowed slightly, but his voice had lost its earlier edge. "I do not know," he admitted. David didn't react to the conversation. He kept one hand resting gently behind Zephyr's ear ridge. his thumb stroking in slow circles like a man comforting a trusted dog. But it wasn't simple petting, it was connection. He was reading Zephyr's body language, his breath, his tension, responding without hesitation, but also without dominance. There was no command, no trick, only presence, only trust, and it was mutual. Zephyr gave a soft, vibrating hum, a resonant tone that made the glass in the chamber buzz lightly. He turned his long neck, bringing his snout closer to David's side, and gently nudged the man's hip. Not with aggression, but with curiosity. David smiled and stepped slightly to the side. "I think he wants to walk," he said casually, then looked to Zaru. "Is that okay?" The room tensed again. Zaru was silent for a beat, then gave a single nod. "If he chooses to accompany you," he said slowly, "then so be it." David took a step forward, then paused, waiting. Zephyr rose in one fluid motion, his wings folding against his back, his tail flicking once before settling low to the ground. He followed David closely, not quite touching, but not straying more than a foot away. It was surreal. A being bred for precision hunting, fearsome enough to clear out planetary colonies, was now walking calmly beside a man who barely came up to its shoulder. As they moved across the marble floor of the chamber, whispers turned into full conversations. Representatives from every corner of the galaxy began discussing what this meant, excited, baffled, even afraid. The Cathar trusted a human. That wasn't just a rare event. It was impossible, or at least it had been until 5 minutes ago. When they reached the center of the chamber, David stopped and crouched beside Zephyr. The Cathar sat down obediently, curling its tail neatly around its claws. "He's not just an animal," David said, raising his voice slightly. "He understands, and he chooses to trust. That matters." Zaru stepped down from the council platform and slowly approached them. Zephyr watched him carefully, but made no aggressive moves. In fact, he seemed at peace. "This is no ordinary moment," Zaru said. "The Cathar are not bred for submission. They are biologically designed to resist control, even from those who raised them from birth. Yet here you are, calm, unarmed, and accepted." David looked up. "Because I didn't try to control him." Zaru studied him. "Explain." "I didn't walk in here thinking I needed to dominate Zephyr," David said. "I didn't see a wild beast that needed breaking. I saw someone misunderstood. Someone alone in a room full of people afraid of him." There were murmurs of agreement and disbelief from around the chamber. "I gave him the same thing I'd give anyone who looked me in the eyes," David continued. "A chance. And he gave me one back." Counselor Karaz, the insectoid being with shimmering wings, tilted his head thoughtfully. "You believe you connected emotionally with a Cathar?" "I know I did." Zaru nodded slowly, his eyes unreadable. "This changes things." David rose from his crouch, brushing imaginary dust from his pants. "That was kind of the idea." Zephyr let out a soft rumble, then nudged David's arm. A ripple of laughter spread through the crowd, hesitant at first, then more genuine. The chamber, once tense and skeptical, now began to shift in mood. Caution gave way to curiosity. Disbelief softened into possibility. Zaru turned back toward the council. "Let the record show that Zephyr, apex predator of the Cathar, has willingly bonded with a human of Earth. Let the record also show that this bond was not achieved through force, technology, or manipulation, but through mutual trust." Several members raised their voices in support. Others simply nodded, stunned. David stepped forward again. "I came here hoping a door. I didn't expect this. But now that the door's open, I think we have a responsibility to walk through it." Zaru regarded him silently, then stepped aside and gestured toward the central platform. "Then let us hear what you propose, human David." David hesitated, not out of fear, but out of the sudden realization that this was real. He was standing in the center of the most powerful council in the galaxy, with a dragon-like predator sitting loyally at his side, and they were all listening. "We can't force trust," he said, "but we can offer it. And maybe, just maybe, that's how peace starts." There was silence again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was reverent. Then, slowly, Zaru did something no one had seen him do in over a decade of council meetings. He bowed his head. "To you, and to Zephyr," he said, "for reminding us what we've forgotten." Zephyr huffed again, a warm mist escaping his nostrils as he shifted comfortably beside David. The moment was sealed. From that day forward, word of the bond between a human and a Cathar spread like wildfire across the galaxy. Scholars scrambled to update theories on Cathar behavior. Diplomats re-examined humanity's potential, and species who once looked down on Earth began to see its people with new eyes. All because a man reached out a hand not to control, but to connect, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The days that followed were anything but quiet. What David and Zephyr had accomplished wasn't just unusual. It had shattered centuries of assumptions across hundreds of worlds. The Galactic Council, once split by long-standing distrust between species, now found itself united in curiosity over a single question. Was this bond real and replicable? The answer wouldn't come from theory. It had to be tested. On the third day, Counselor Karaz, the winged insectoid being from the planet Eurith, called a special session. The human and the Cathar Karaz clicked, have demonstrated trust. But trust is one moment. What we require now is evidence of resilience. David sat in the center of the chamber, Zephyr lounging quietly behind him. He exchanged a glance with the Cathar, who blinked slowly, as if unfazed by the attention. "We propose a series of structured trials," Karaz continued. "Environments designed to test cooperation, intelligence, and emotional synchronization." David stood, voice steady. "We accept." He didn't hesitate. Neither did Zephyr. The first trial began the next day. It was set inside a vast bioluminescent forest simulation, an artificial environment built within the Council's central dome. Dense foliage, shifting terrain, and unknown dangers awaited. The trial's objective: reach the exit using only teamwork and instinct. David stepped through the gates with Zephyr at his side. No gear, no weapons, just trust. As the doors closed behind them, a thick mist rolled through the forest. Visibility dropped. Alien bird calls echoed from every direction. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of rushing water masked the subtle click of mechanical traps. David exhaled slowly. "All right, Zeph, let's keep it tight." They moved as one. David crouched low, brushing past oversized leaves and scanning for hidden tripwires. Zephyr crept silently beside him, nostrils flaring, ears twitching at every subtle noise. At one point, a net trap dropped from the canopy. Zephyr lunged without hesitation, slashing the mesh midair before it could ensnare David. "Nice catch," David muttered, giving him a quick pat. They pressed on. Hours passed. The terrain grew more hostile. Sudden pits, narrow ledges, simulated predators lurking in the undergrowth. In every situation, David would pause, glance at Zephyr, and without a word exchanged, the Cathar would guide him. When a fork in the path presented itself, Zephyr's ears would twitch toward the correct route. When danger loomed, his body would tense just a second before a hidden threat struck. Then came the chasm. They stood on the edge of a 100-foot drop, with a narrow bridge made of vines and swaying planks stretching across. One wrong step, and it was a long way down. David looked at Zephyr. "You think we can fly it?" Zephyr flexed his wings, causing a gust of wind that made the bridge sway even more dangerously. The Cathar snorted, then crouched low. "I'll take that as a yes." David climbed onto his back, gripping the harness that had been designed especially for the trials. Zephyr flared his wings wide, then leapt. The flight was brief but breathtaking. They landed cleanly on the other side. David let out a laugh and gave Zephyr a firm pat on the neck. That's what I'm talking about. From their observation platform above, the council watched silently. Zaru stood with arms crossed, his gaze locked on the screens. Beside him, Counselor Karaz finally clicked in admiration. They move as one. This bond is no illusion. The second trial was more cerebral. David and Zephyr were placed in a massive echo chamber, a hall of smooth walls and shifting corridors, where doors only responded to sequences of light and sound. The test? Navigate the maze by learning the pattern? It was a puzzle. David crouched low. All right, buddy. We need to figure this out fast. He whistled a short note. A wall flashed red. He tried again, 2 short whistles. This time, a different wall blinked green. Zephyr tilted his head, then let out a low growl, mimicking the pitch. One door opened. David's eyes lit up. You got it. They moved forward, working together. A symphony of tones and cues. David would mimic a rhythm with claps or hums. Zephyr would follow with his own sounds, clicks, growls, even chirps, testing different sequences until the walls responded. At one point, they reached a dead end. David slumped against the wall, breathing heavily. I don't get it. None of it's working anymore. Zephyr nudged him sharply with his snout, then let out a high-pitched, almost shattering growl. David looked at him, eyebrows raised. You think we've been copying the wrong pattern? Another nudge. David stood up, then tried whistling in reverse, flipping the rhythm. A new door slid open. Ha! Zephyr, you genius. They emerged from the chamber a few hours later, both panting and covered in sweat and dust. Above them, a round of applause echoed through the viewing dome. Even the normally reserved Zaru gave a slow, approving nod. Their ability to adapt is exceptional, he admitted, but the third trial would be the hardest. They were dropped on the surface of Akko, a harsh desert planet known for blistering days, freezing nights, and minimal life. Supplies were limited. No guidance. Just a location beacon miles away and a simple instruction. Survive and make it to extraction. The sun beat down without mercy. The sand was like burning glass. David wrapped a scarf around his neck, trying to shield himself. Zephyr trudged beside him, wings tucked tight, eyes scanning constantly. They moved slowly, carefully. When the first sandstorm hit, they sheltered beneath a jagged rock outcropping. When dehydration set in, Zephyr used his senses to lead David toward a hidden spring tucked inside a canyon wall. At night, they slept in turns. Zephyr would lie with his body curled protectively around David, his eyes glowing faintly in the dark as he kept watch. David, in return, offered his own presence, calming the Cathar with quiet conversation, shared silence, and the occasional joke. They didn't just survive, they thrived. They hunted small desert lizards, built crude shade shelters, shared food and warmth. And slowly, that connection between them grew into something beyond instinct or training. It became friendship. 5 days in, as they finally reached the extraction point, a small council ship touched down with a roar of engines. Counselors awaited them outside, flanked by observers and recording drones. David stumbled forward, sunburned, dirty, exhausted. Zephyr was limping slightly from a scrape on his leg, but both were alert and smiling. Zaru approached them. First, his expression, for once, was soft. You passed, he said. Every trial. Every challenge. David nodded, his voice hoarse. We didn't pass because of strength, counselor. We passed because of trust. That's what made it work. Zaru looked down at Zephyr. The Cathar stared back then. In a gesture that silenced even the most skeptical, lowered his head and gently pressed it against David's chest. Zaru turned to the council. This bond is not only real, it is transformative. Applause erupted. Voices in every language echoed through the canyon. David looked down at Zephyr. placing a hand on his neck. "We're just getting started," he whispered. The extraction ship touched down gently on a wide landing platform nestled within the Council's mountainside headquarters. The doors hissed open, and warm, sterile light spilled out, greeting David and Zephyr as they stepped onto solid ground for the first time in days. They looked rough, no doubt about it. David's clothes were torn at the seams, dust and sand caked into every fold. His skin was sunburned in patches, and his eyes were red from exhaustion. Zephyr, towering beside him, had a deep scratch on his flank and moved with a slight limp. But they were both standing, and more importantly, they were standing together. A small crowd had gathered: counselors, aides, researchers, translators, even members of the media from several planets. Word of David and Zephyr's progress during the trials had spread like wildfire through the galactic network. Everyone wanted to see them in person now. The human and the Cathar who had done the impossible. Counselor Zaru was the first to step forward. His normally guarded expression softened ever so slightly as he looked from David to Zephyr and back again. "You have passed all 3 trials," he said, his voice resonating through the plaza. "Not with brute strength or cunning strategy, but with unity, mutual trust, and resilience." David offered a tired smile. "We just did what felt right." Zaru turned to face the assembly. "Let it be recorded that human David and Zephyr of the Cathar have completed every test the Council designed to assess their bond. They did not merely survive, they excelled, and through their actions, they have revealed a truth we have long ignored." He let the words hang in the air for a moment. That cooperation between species, true cooperation, is not only possible, it is powerful. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Heads nodded. Wings buzzed. Tentacles twitched in affirmation. For so long, the Galactic Council had functioned on pragmatism and caution. Species coexisted through contracts, treaties, and security zones, not connection. But what they had just witnessed challenged that structure. Here was a predator feared across systems, and a human once considered unremarkable by galactic standards. Together, they had formed something new, something worth understanding. Zaru stepped closer to David. "You've done more than complete trials," he said, quieter now. "You've become a symbol." David blinked. "A symbol?" Zaru nodded. "Of what we've all forgotten." Later that day, after medical scans and some much-needed food and rest, David sat with Zephyr in one of the Council's private garden sanctuaries. It was a quiet space, filled with bioluminescent trees and artificial streams designed to ease the stress of intergalactic politics. The sun was artificial, but the warmth on his skin felt real. Zephyr lay curled beside him, wings folded tight, tail gently sweeping across the grass. David scratched the back of Zephyr's head. "Looks like we stirred up a storm, huh?" Zephyr let out a soft, pleased rumble in response. David leaned back on the stone bench and sighed. "I didn't come here to make history. I don't know. I wanted to show them we're not as small or as simple as they think we are." Zephyr shifted slightly, nuzzling David's shoulder with his snout. "And now," David said, "we're proof that something different is possible." A soft chime rang through the garden, a signal requesting their return to the council chamber. "Guess break time's over," David murmured, rising slowly. "See you Monday, Zeph. Let's go see what the galaxy wants from us now." The chamber was more crowded than usual. Representatives from hundreds of systems filled the seats, some remote attendees projected in shimmering light, others physically present with all their various shapes and forms. The energy was electric. Cameras floated silently around the perimeter, streaming the session live across dozens of star systems. Counselor Zaru stood at the central podium. "Today, we do not meet in debate or dispute," he began. "Today, we meet to acknowledge something extraordinary." He gestured toward David and Zephyr, now standing in the center ring. "We have long operated under the belief that interspecies relationships must be measured, guarded and enforced. But this bond defies every barrier we thought immovable. Karaz, the insectoid counselor, stepped forward next. His wings shimmered faintly as he clicked. It is not just the bond itself that matters, but what it represents. If a human and a Cathar, two of the galaxy's most biologically incompatible beings, can work together, what does that say about the rest of us? The chamber fell quiet. David glanced around. He hadn't come prepared to speak, but he didn't need notes. This wasn't politics. It was personal. "I grew up hearing that space was cold," he began, his voice steady, empty, unforgiving. "But I think it only feels that way because we haven't filled it with enough trust yet." He looked down at Zephyr, who sat patiently beside him, tail wrapped neatly over his claws. "I didn't bond with Zephyr to make a point. I didn't tame him. He's not mine. We just listen to each other. That's it. No tech, no translators, just time, attention, respect." He turned to the crowd again. "Imagine if we offered that to each other. Not as species, not as diplomats, just as beings." A pause, a deep breath. "I'm not saying it's easy, but it's possible, and that's enough to change everything." When he finished, the room remained silent, but this time it wasn't hesitation. It was respect. Then slowly, Counselor Zaru raised a hand. "I propose the creation of a new initiative," he declared. "A structured effort to explore the potential of interspecies bonds, one built not on science or politics, but on trust. We shall call it the Intergalactic Bonding Initiative." Murmurs echoed across the chamber. Karaz stepped forward. This program would pair willing individuals from different species with compatible companions. It will not be forced. It will not be controlled. But it will be supported with resources, protection, and oversight. Zaru turned toward David. "And we would like you, human David, to lead it." David froze. He hadn't expected that. "You want me to run this? You've lived it," Zaru replied. "There is no one more qualified." David looked down at Zephyr. The Cathar stared back at him with steady, unblinking eyes. Then David nodded. "I'm in." Within days, preparations began. The Intergalactic Bonding Initiative wasn't just an idea, it was becoming a movement. Representatives from dozens of species volunteered to participate in the first wave. The Council approved resources, allocated ships, and set up communication hubs across the core worlds. David and Zephyr were at the center of it all. They traveled system by system, sharing their story. Not as a miracle or anomaly, but as an example. Each world had its own doubts, its own fears, but seeing the bond firsthand, that changed people. On some worlds like Ilinari, species that had been isolated for centuries began reaching out. On others, like Theska, war-torn factions paused long enough to consider a new kind of diplomacy, one rooted in partnership rather than power. Everywhere they went, Zephyr remained close at David's side, silent, alert, and proud. He wasn't a mascot. He wasn't a tool. He was a partner, and the galaxy was beginning to understand what that meant. One evening, after a long day of speaking with delegates on the planet Koresh, David and Zephyr found themselves alone again, watching the twin moons rise over a glassy lake. David sat with his legs stretched out, boots half off, a canteen in one hand. "You know," he said, his voice soft, "when I first came to the council, I figured they'd laugh us out of the chamber." Zephyr gave a soft snort. "But now look at us," David continued. "You and me. Changing the way the galaxy thinks." Zephyr leaned into him slightly, resting his snout on David's shoulder. David smiled. "Yeah," he whispered. "I think we're just getting started." The Council's decision sparked a transformation the galaxy hadn't seen in generations. The Intergalactic Bonding Initiative wasn't just another political program or scientific experiment, it was a leap of faith, an attempt to build genuine trust across species that had, for centuries, barely tolerated each other under the guise of peace. And leading the charge were two unlikely ambassadors, a sun-weathered human from Earth and a white-scaled apex predator who once made entire colonies tremble. David and Zephyr. They didn't ask for the spotlight, but it followed them anyway. From the moment the council formally approved the program, the pair became the face of a movement that crossed borders, broke barriers, and demanded that the galaxy stop seeing each other as threats or strangers and start seeing one another as partners. David's first mission under the new initiative took him to a planet called Those, located in the Outer Crescent. It was a world cloaked in green, where the skies glowed amber at sunset and the forests whispered ancient songs with every gust of wind. The people of Those, the Idris, were tree-like sentient beings, towering, slow-moving, deeply rooted in tradition and suspicion. For centuries, they kept themselves isolated, refusing contact with the council except for the bare minimum. No diplomacy, no technology exchange, no cultural contact. Convincing them to open up wouldn't be easy. But David knew that if the initiative was going to work, it needed to start with the hardest hearts. He and Zephyr arrived during the season of stillness, a time when the Idris gathered to reflect and renew their commitment to ancestral memory. They stepped off the transport shuttle into a clearing surrounded by massive bark-covered beings that stood so still they could have been mistaken for ancient trees. David adjusted his jacket and took a few cautious steps forward. Zephyr followed, his tail swishing low to the ground, eyes scanning but unthreatened. Tall Idris with darker bark and glowing amber eyes stepped forward. "I'm Elder Thaler," the being said, its voice deep and resonant like wind through hollow wood. "We have heard of your bond." David bowed his head slightly. "Thank you for receiving us, Elder. We've come in peace and with hope." Thaler's eyes flicked to Zephyr. "Hope, you say? Yet you bring a predator to our sacred grove." David didn't react defensively. He simply placed a hand on Zephyr's neck. "This predator saved my life more times than I can count. He's not here to threaten anyone. He's here because he chose to come, and because he trusts me." There was a long silence. Then, Thaler gestured toward a gathering of Idris nearby. "If your bond is what you claim, then show us. Let your actions speak." David and Zephyr spent the next week living among the Idris, sleeping in woven root shelters and walking the forest paths under bioluminescent canopies. Every day they demonstrated what it meant to be bonded not through speeches, but through presence. David helped the Idris gather rare pollen high in the treetops. Zephyr flew him up, guided by quiet gestures and subtle movements. At night, they joined the Idris at reflection circles, where David would share stories of the trials, of the desert, of the echo maze. Zephyr would lay beside him, content and calm, never once baring his teeth or flexing his wings in warning. It wasn't long before one of the younger Idris, a sapling-aged being named Arendor, stepped forward. "I wish to participate," Arendor said during the evening circle. "I believe the bond between the human and the Cathar is not an anomaly. It is a beginning." Thaler didn't speak right away. He turned his gaze toward Zephyr, who, to the Idris' amazement, stepped forward and bowed his head low in a gesture of respect. "That," Thaler said softly, "is a language we have not heard in many cycles." The next morning, David and Zephyr left Those with Arendor walking beside them. The momentum grew fast. Word of their visit to Those spread across the galaxy like a solar flare. Other worlds that had once kept their distance now reached out, curious. Representatives from species who had never even spoken face-to-face began requesting entry into the program. And each time David visited a new world, the same thing happened. The skepticism turned to wonder, and the fear slowly gave way to trust. There was the aquatic moon Veralis, where David swam alongside an amphibian diplomat named Kieran and her serpentine companion through a maze of underwater caverns. It was the storm-torn colony of Rentual, where a nomadic warrior bonded with a telepathic avian, learning to coordinate attacks and share emotions mid-battle. Even the hardline diplomats from the Tarnak combine a militant society known for viewing emotion as weakness requested to observe. What they saw couldn't be ignored. These weren't forced connections. They weren't staged. They were real. For David, the work was exhausting but worth it. Every world brought new challenges. Some viewed Zephyr with fear. Others thought David had used secret technology or neural manipulation. But again and again, the truth became clear. The bond he and Zephyr shared was built on nothing more than honest respect and patience. Zephyr, for his part, never faltered. He remained fiercely loyal, alert, but never aggressive. He learned to read new species the way he had once learned David. He adapted to their rhythms, their cues. He understood when to keep his distance and when to show trust. Their partnership wasn't just an example, it was a blueprint. Back on the Council's homeworld, a new structure was being built at the heart of the capital, a massive facility made of glass, stone, and living vines. It would serve as the headquarters for the bonding initiative, complete with training fields, dormitories, species-specific ecosystems, and observation centers. They called it Unity Hall. David walked the construction site with Zeru one afternoon, watching as teams of humans, aliens, and bonded creatures worked side by side. "This has become more than we imagined," Zeru admitted. David nodded, brushing a hand through his hair. "Honestly, I didn't think we'd make it past the first trial." Zeru tuned to him. "You're not a soldier, David, not a scientist, not a career diplomat, and yet you succeeded where all of them failed." "Why?" David thought for a second, then looked over at Zephyr, who was curled in the shade nearby, watching birds flutter through the scaffolding. "Because I didn't try to change him," David said. "I just listened, and I let him listen back." Zeru gave a rare smile. "The Council was wrong about your species. We were wrong about a lot of things," David chuckled. "Well, we're all learning." As the years passed, the intergalactic bonding initiative became something no one had predicted. Conflicts between rival species began to lessen. Trade alliances formed through shared bonds. New scientific discoveries emerged not just about the nature of the creatures being bonded, but about the emotional intelligence of species long considered lesser. For the first time in galactic history, the Council reported 0 active wars in a calendar year. Unity wasn't perfect, it never would be, but for the first time, it was possible. And at the center of it all, of every headline, every new connection, every hopeful first bond, stood David and Zephyr. Partners, friends, legends. Not because they'd planned it, but because they'd simply believed it could happen. Years passed. The galaxy changed not overnight, not without setbacks, but undeniably. The intergalactic bonding initiative, once an uncertain experiment, had become a defining movement of a new age. From the icy moons of Calyrex to the floating cities of Atrion, thousands of species were connecting through bonds previously thought impossible. And at the heart of it all remained the first pair. The origin story, the proof that it could be done. David and Zephyr, they had become more than symbols, more than ambassadors. They were the heartbeat of a quiet revolution built not on force, but on understanding. From their first handshake in the Galactic Council chamber to the hundreds of worlds they had traveled together, the bond between human and Cathar had not only endured, it had deepened. Zephyr was no longer just David's partner. He was family, a constant, loyal presence, not tamed, not owned, but equal. One afternoon, years after their first encounter, they returned to where it all began, the council chamber. It looked different, now warmer somehow. Banners of unity fluttered overhead, embroidered with symbols from every participating species. The once sterile platform was now surrounded by open seating, small gardens, and soft lighting. What had once been a place of suspicion and division had become a place of hope. David stood on the steps outside the building, looking over the bustling plaza below. Everywhere he looked, he saw the impact of their journey. A young human girl knelt beside a sleek, scaled creature with 4 eyes, gently feeding it from her palm. 2 diplomats, one from a gas giant floating species, and another from a desert world, laughed over a shared cup of stim brew. A pair of council guards, once stationed far apart for safety, now stood shoulder to shoulder, petting their own bonded companions. Zephyr sat beside David, watching it all quietly, his long tail curling slowly behind him. The scar from their desert trial was still visible, just a faint mark now, but a reminder of where they'd come from. David scratched under Zephyr's chin. "Remember when they called you a monster?" Zephyr let out a soft huff, leaning into the touch. "Now look at you," David said with a smirk. "You're a role model." Just then, a group of young recruits from the initiative passed by. They stopped when they saw David and Zephyr. One of them, a wide-eyed trainee from the planet Yong, stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly. "Are you really the David?" David gave her a half-smile. "Depends on which David you're looking for. The guy who almost got eaten in the forest trial, or the guy who got sunburned so bad on Akko that he had to use tree sap as ointment?" The group chuckled, relaxing instantly. "You inspired us," she said, more confidently now. "We just completed our first co-training mission. It wasn't perfect, but we learned to listen." "Just like you said," David nodded. "That's all it takes. Not perfection, just a willingness to try." They said their goodbyes and moved on, leaving David and Zephyr standing in silence again. That evening, inside the chamber, the council gathered for an anniversary summit 10 years since the initiative's launch. Delegates gave updates, shared success stories, and proposed expansions into new regions. David was honored as a founding leader, his name inscribed on a monument alongside Zephyr's, a symbol of the first true bond. But when he was called to speak, David didn't stand on ceremony. He stepped to the podium, placed both hands flat on its surface, and looked around the chamber. "Do you remember?" he asked. "How it started?" The crowd leaned in. "One question," David continued. "That's all it was. I asked if I could pet a dragon." Soft laughter echoed through the room, and everyone thought I was either stupid or suicidal. But the truth is, I just saw someone misunderstood, and I wanted to say, "Hey, I see you, that's it." He paused. I didn't know what would happen. I didn't have a plan, but I had trust, and I had time to listen. David glanced back at Zephyr, sitting calmly at the edge of the chamber. That's what changed everything. He turned back to the audience. "You don't need to be special to make a difference. You don't need weapons or degrees or centuries of training. Sometimes, all it takes is showing up with your heart open." He stepped down to a wave of applause, not the polite kind, but the real kind. The kind that comes from people who get it, because they lived it too. Later that night, back in his quarters, David sat by the window looking out at the stars. Zephyr lay curled nearby, snoring softly. He had grown slightly older, his scales a bit duller, his movements slower, but the fire in his eyes still burned bright. David reached for a small, worn leather notebook. It was the same one he had carried during the early missions, filled with sketches, half-formed ideas, and scrawled observations from sleepless nights in alien forests. He flipped to the last page and began to write. "They didn't believe in us at first, but now they do. Not because we proved we were better, but because we proved we were willing to listen, to trust, to care." He set the pen down and looked back at Zephyr. "Funny thing is," he said softly, "I came out here to prove humans belonged in the stars. But I think you're the one who showed me how." In the years that followed, the galaxy continued to grow, not just in trade and travel, but in connection. The initiative expanded to distant systems, even beyond Council jurisdiction. Some worlds that had once refused all contact now welcomed bonding trainers and integration teams. Conflicts still happened, of course, No movement could erase every scar, but those conflicts were smaller, shorter, and far less common. Because now, when people looked across borders, they didn't just see enemies or strangers. They saw the possibility of a bond. And what about us? What do we take from this fictional galaxy of alien worlds and dragon-like companions? The truth is, it's not really about the stars. It's about us here now, because we live in a world that's often divided by borders, by belief, by fear. We're told that difference is dangerous, that the unknown should be kept at arm's length. But what if we did what David did? What if we asked the hard questions not to challenge, but to connect? What if we looked at someone we didn't understand and said, "I see you. I want to try." We may not have dragons or echo chambers or interstellar councils, but we have each other, and sometimes that's enough to change the world, one bond at a time.